Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and welcome to my little deck declutter wrap-up, where we're going to talk about some of the lessons that I learned and tips I picked up while culling my entire deck collection. So I talked a little bit about why I wanted to do this culling in the first place, I believe in the first video. But just to kind of recap, the main reason that I was looking to cull my collection was because that I was starting to feel a little bit of deck overwhelm. I had a lot of decks and I was kind of feeling like they were just spilling out of my shelves, they were spilling out of boxes, and it was getting to the point where I felt like I had decks that just weren't getting any use, probably because I couldn't find them. And so that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to kind of cull things down, just to kind of weed out some of the decks that I'm no longer working with or don't resonate with me anymore, and to make space for those decks that do, as well as just to kind of pare them down a little bit into a little bit more of a succinct collection for me, and decks that I felt like really supported my personal practice. So that was kind of the main reason why I wanted to do this whole declutter, was to really get my collection honed into the decks that I'm actually using and working with, and to clear out decks that really were repetitive in my collection. So decks that maybe had the same energy or the same purpose, and then really taking a look at those and seeing, okay, which of those do I actually like the best? Which do I prefer? Which do I tend to use the most? So I pulled all the decks off my shelf, kind of divided them up into categories, and then I went through the process of actually culling them. And I did talk about that whole process, but just to kind of sum up on that, what I did was I took every deck and I looked at it and I asked myself a couple of key questions. The main being, what's this deck's place in my collection? How often do I use it? And do I have other decks that serve that same purpose? So that was really my criteria for whether or not I was going to keep a deck or whether or not it was going to end up in the rehome pile. So after that whole process, I kind of straightened everything up, put things back. I did do cleaning, like actually cleaning my shelves and stuff as well, cleaning out the baskets, wiping down boxes, things of that nature. So I did do a little bit of sort of spring cleaning in between there as well. And afterwards, I kind of sat down and really thought about the whole process and made some notes about the lessons that I've learned, kind of the tips that I've come away with, and some of the things that I really want to keep in mind moving forward. So I do have my notes just off camera here, so I will be checking those on occasion just to make sure that I'm staying on topic for this video. So I think the key lesson that I learned through this whole process was that I wasn't actually intentionally curating my deck collection. I was just buying decks. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. For sure, there's nothing wrong with that. But I really wanted to make sure that the decks that I had in my collection were actually serving some sort of purpose for me, that they were actually supporting my personal practice, my spiritual practice, or my personal growth in some way. Now, the small caveat or exception to that would be decks that I have strictly for sentimental value or maybe for collector's purposes, and that's really just a small handful for me. But that was my big sort of takeaway. The key lesson that I've learned is that I really don't want to just buy decks just to buy decks. I want to make sure that the decks I'm bringing in, with the exception of decks I get sent for review, because that's a little bit different, right? That's a little bit different story. But I really want to make sure that the decks that I'm personally bringing into my collection are decks that really resonate with me and will support my practice as a whole. So a couple of the lessons that I learned along this journey. First and foremost is that I had a lot of decks that had repetitive energies. So these would be things like I had multiple animal decks, or I had multiple goddess decks, or I had multiple witchy decks. And so I noticed that there was quite a bit of overlap in not only the energy of the deck, but how I actually use them. And some of them were really close in style or aesthetic or theme. And so I realized that it was really just a kind of either or situation. They both decks would serve the same purpose. I would use them in the same way, and they were basically just kind of mirrors of each other. And so in those cases, what I did was really sit down and look at which one do I use the most, which one maybe matches the majority of my decks, which one do I pair more often, particularly when it came to Oracle. That was a huge consideration. When I was looking at two Oracle decks that had similar themes or energies, it really did a lot of times come down to which deck can I pair with more tarot decks. So I would end up keeping the one that just kind of matched more of the decks in my collection. For example, when it came down to two of my animal oracles, we had the animal spirits and the animal kin. I really like both of those decks, but what it came down to is the animal spirit actually pairs better with the majority of my tarot decks. So that's the one I ended up keeping, and the animal kin I ended up rehoming. So along those same lines, I realized that many of the decks also serve the same purpose. So I would have like multiple decks that maybe I would use for moon work, or multiple decks that I would maybe use for self-care. And so again, looking at that repetitive energy and looking at those decks of, do they each bring something different to that work, or are they basically doing the same thing for me? And in that case, which one do I like better? And so again, just trying to kind of pare down and keeping it kind of really succinct to my practice and how I actually worked with the decks and which decks I was using more than others. So another lesson that I learned was that I actually had several decks that I had used a handful of times or less. Now, there's nothing wrong with only using a deck a couple of times a year, because for me, especially with my practice being very seasonal, there are decks that I only use during the spring or only use during the autumn. And so those decks may only come out once or twice a year, but they consistently come out every year. And so that was one of the key things that I was looking at. Is that the case, or is it just a deck that I pulled it out, used it once, and put it back on the shelf? What I call my one and done decks. And I did find that I had quite a few of those. And so pretty much if it was a one and done deck for me, that pretty much told me that it was time for that deck to move on to a new home. So another key lesson that I learned was that some of my older decks just don't resonate with me anymore, particularly some of the decks that I bought many years ago, or decks that I bought when I was beginning learning certain different practices or exploring different avenues of my personal growth or my spiritual path. And sometimes those decks that, while they served a great purpose in the beginning or during that time, they just didn't apply anymore. And one of the things that I definitely learned is that it's okay to let go of those decks. It's okay to have a deck that I used for maybe several months and it was a key deck, but now it's no longer really applicable or doesn't really resonate with what I'm doing currently. And so I've learned that it's okay for me to let those decks go. Just because it was once a favored deck does not mean it will always be a favored deck. And also, again, doesn't mean that it's always going to resonate with me, because sometimes, we grow and we change and we move on. And some of the decks that used to really support and serve my practice no longer do, or just don't quite fit with what I'm doing now. And so that was another thing that I really had to take a look at, particularly in terms of some of my older decks, because some of them, while I do keep some of them that are like nostalgia, right? Like my Legacy of the Divine, for example, that deck doesn't resonate with my practice at all, like at all anymore. But it was the first deck I ever purchased for myself. I've had it for several decades now, and so it's probably one I will always have because it has sentimental value to me. So it is important to distinguish between those two things, right? The decks that we keep that maybe no longer serve a purpose, but they have a significant meaning for me. So while the Legacy of the Divine doesn't serve a purpose any longer in my collection, it does have a significance and a personal meaning for me, so it is one that I did decide to hold on to. But one of the big things that I learned was that it's okay to let go of the ones that don't serve any purpose anymore, or that I've moved on from, and that I don't really have any personal connection to anymore. Another really key lesson that I learned is that there is a big difference between I'm actually going to work with this deck in the near future, and I have this deck, so I should probably work with it at some time, right? There's a big difference between those two things, because sometimes I would get a deck and I'd be like, okay, I'm going to study this deck, but I don't have the space for that right now, so I'm going to set aside time maybe later on this year or in a different season, and I'm going to study and work with that deck then. Versus, oh look, I got this new deck in and I don't have time to work with it right now, so I'm just going to shove it on the shelf and go, I'll get to it. There is a difference, at least for me, because I found the decks that I did that, I'll get to it at some point, oftentimes I didn't. So when I would buy a deck, knowing that it's a deck that I want to study, but also knowing that I don't have time for that right now, it's more likely that I will come back to actually study that when it's something that I've set out intentionally to do or set out intentionally to work with. versus when I get a deck and I'm like, ooh, this is great and it's pretty and I do want to work with it, but not right now. So just shove it on a shelf. Not that I don't come back to those decks at some point, but I've noticed, at least for me personally, I'm less likely to come back to those decks, and they do tend to sit on my shelves a bit more. And I don't know if it's just like because I haven't made the mindful connection or the set myself with the intention to actually work with that deck, like actually within myself, not to just say, ooh, I'm gonna work with that someday. One of the things like putting out videos when I say, here's the decks I'm going to work with for the year, that is me stating that intention mindfully and out loud and setting that goal for myself so that there will be some accountability for my own self, right? Versus I get a deck and I'm like, oh, here it is, it's cool, and shove it on the shelf and I'll get to it, right? So that could just totally be me, because that could totally be a personality thing. But again, that's just something that I noticed. One of the lessons that I learned about myself is that there's a difference between getting a deck and setting it aside to intentionally work with it later, and getting a deck and setting it aside just because I just don't have the time to deal with it right now. So for me, that's a big difference. Another big difference that I discovered, or sort of lesson that I learned about myself, is that there's a big difference between being a deck consumer and a deck collector. Because there are times when I am full on a deck consumer. I will just hit that buy button because I don't know, because I want it, because somebody said it was great, because, right? For whatever reason. There really isn't an intention or a purpose behind that purchase. It's just kind of tends to be an in the moment. And in that point, I'm just being a deck consumer. Now, there is nothing wrong with being a deck consumer, but it is different than being a deck collector, where you are going out and mindfully selecting the decks that you want to bring into your collection, where you are really looking at, kind of those key things. How will I use it? What purpose is it going to serve? Do I have other things that are similar to it? And this may all just be, lingo, but for me, that's kind of how my brain has categorized it. There are times when I am a deck consumer and times when I am a deck collector. When the times that I'm a consumer, I'm just buying decks. There's not a lot of thought, intention, or mindfulness about the purchase. That doesn't mean that those purchases aren't valid or that, they're bad in any sort of way. It's just being aware of why I'm making a purchase. So being aware of when I'm being a consumer and I'm just buying just to buy because that pretty shiny thing caught my attention and I want it, versus when I'm being a deck collector and I am really looking at what this deck is, how it's going to work for me, what purpose it's going to serve, and what else do I have that might be similar, and will it have a place for me? So it really comes down to just buying versus intentionally buying, right? But my brain has categorized that into two different categories, where sometimes I'm being a deck consumer and I'm just buying decks, and other times I'm being a deck collector where I'm mindfully curating my collection. So that's just a little distinction that has really helped me in how I'm looking at my purchases moving forward. So whenever I'm making a purchase, I'm kind of asking myself, what mindset am I in? Am I in the consumer mindset or the collector mindset? Again, nothing wrong with either one. This is just how my little brain has organized those two concepts so that I can be more aware of what I'm doing and how it's going to affect my practice and my collection as a whole. A lot of times when I'm just being a deck consumer, there's a good chance that that deck isn't going to permanently stay in my collection. It may just be for a time, for a season, or for a purpose, and then it might move on. Again, nothing wrong with that. But when I'm being a deck collector, those are the decks that tend to stay. They tend to become permanent fixtures in my practice and permanent fixtures in my collection. So I just found that to be really helpful for me, just to shift my mindset and to be really aware of when I'm in one particular mindset over the other. Again, nothing wrong with either one. It's just for me being aware of where I'm at and how I'm approaching the process has been really helpful for me, being aware of those times when maybe I'm just buying a deck and do I really need it? Maybe I do, maybe I don't. But it just has helped me to become more aware of that. So let's talk about some of the other kind of takeaways that I've come away with. That didn't really come out right, but some of the takeaways that I've come away with for cultivating a mindful collection for myself, and maybe this might be helpful to you as well. The first thing is that it's okay to try new decks, but I need to be willing to pass them along if they don't work out. So I'm really guilty of like, oh, I think this deck might work out for me. And I get it, and I'm like, it kind of misses the mark, and it doesn't really work. So it goes into a box or in the closet or something, and it just gets shoved to the side. So rather than doing that and amassing a, box full of decks that didn't work out for me, one of the things that I want to try to do is to move those along when that happens. I don't often know if a deck is going to work out for me until I get it in my hands. Because sometimes it's a feeling, right? And sometimes I need to experience the deck before I really know for sure. And that's all well and good, but I need to make sure that when it doesn't work out, that I don't just shove it somewhere and try to forget about it. Instead, I want to try to focus on moving it along. And I know there's lots of groups for that on Facebook, so I just, need to be more mindful of that for myself and not shove things aside to be dealt with later and kind of just deal with them in the moment, because I think that will help me not amass a big collection of decks that I already know don't work for me, but they're just hanging out in my closet because I haven't done anything with them yet. So the other kind of key thing that I'm going to be looking at when curating my own collection mindfully is that before I purchase a new deck, I really want to take a look at what I already have in my collection and see if I have any of that overlap. Do I have things that serve the same purpose? Do I have things that have the same theme or energy? And is this just a mirror deck of something I already have, or does it bring something different to the table? Now, again, that's back to that sort of consumer versus collector mindset that I'm getting into. And when I'm asking myself those questions, I am shifting into that sort of collector mindset, because I'm trying to look at my collection and go, what do I already have? And what is this deck going to bring into my collection that's going to be different or add to my practice, as it were? So that does also kind of wrap back into the point I just made of, sometimes I need to try a deck before I will really know that. If I get a deck and I think, yeah, I have similar, but maybe this one might be a little bit different or might support my practice in this little bit different way, and I get it in, and then I'm like, oh, nope, that didn't. It's the same exact deck, basically. It's serving the same purpose for me. So again, back to tip number one, I need to move that along. So another key takeaway that I've discovered for myself is that I have to determine my own personal comfort level when it comes to my deck collection. So whether that's the restriction of like a certain number of decks or space, for me personally, I am most comfortable when the decks that I own will fit on my shelving. When it starts overflowing into boxes and bins and closets and things of that nature, that's when I start feeling a little bit overwhelmed. When I can't put things in their place, that's when I start getting deck overwhelm. So for me personally, my comfort level is what I can fit on my shelves. It's not a certain number of decks, although I know for a lot of people, that's a key element for determining their comfort level, which I think is really great. I'm comfortable with X amount of decks in my collection. So when you hit that number, then I think it's time to start looking at, is it time to start moving some of these decks along? Or maybe do I need to adjust my comfort zone? Because that's also a thing too, right? But for me, the key was determining what my comfort zone was for the size of my collection. As I said, for me, it's what will fit on my shelves. And as long as I keep that in mind, then I know that my collection is going to maintain at a comfortable size and space for me. And so that's also something that I'm trying to keep in mind in the back of my mind when I'm doing any shopping. Like, if I'm going to buy this deck, is this going to put me over my comfort zone? And if it is, maybe I need to consider that. So the biggest takeaway, I think, for me is to acknowledge what my collection means to me and what purpose it serves. So why do I have these decks, right? What am I doing with them? Why are they here? And what purpose do they serve? And to just always have that in the back of my mind that for me, my collection supports my personal growth practice, my spiritual practice, and of course, my tarot reading practice, right? My personal practice, because again, I don't read professionally, so it's all for me. So everything that I have in my collection needs to support me or my family. And as long as it's doing that, then I'm good with it. But I do like to keep that in the back of my mind of, this is what it's here for. So I need to make sure that what I'm bringing in is going to support that. So then after I kind of looked at all those little aha moments that I had, I set down kind of a couple of little collecting strategies that I might try to adopt along the way, or that maybe might be helpful for you if you're looking at kind of managing or curtailing your own deck collection. So the first of the collecting strategies is to reconnect with the decks I already have rather than buying more, right? That makes the most sense. That's the most logical way to approach your whole deck collection, is to really focus on the ones that you have first and get to know those, work with those, study those, however it is that you interact with your decks. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to do, is kind of connect with the decks that I already have. I have several decks that I bought in 2020 that I'm still working through studying this year and will be for the whole year. So I really do want to try to focus in on those decks, some of which I've had actually for several years that I still haven't gotten around to study yet, and I'm going to try to make that a priority this year. So really just trying to focus in on the decks that I already have, because that's the great way to approach it, right? So another collecting strategy that I'm going to adopt is, as I mentioned, rehoming the decks so I don't end up hoarding unwanted decks in my closet. Another thing is for me to get really clear about why I want to buy that deck, to be perfectly honest with myself. So I'm on Amazon and I'm looking at a deck, and I need to honestly ask myself, why do you want that deck? Really, bottom line, why do you want that deck? Do you want to buy it just because you want to buy something right now? Or do you want to buy it because it's pretty and you want to see what it looks like in person? Do you want to buy it because you think it's going to add something to your personal practice? Get really clear with yourself. This is me telling me, get really clear with yourself. If that resonates with you too, great. But this is me telling myself, be honest and get really clear with why you're buying that deck. Are you buying it because Lisa told you to do it? Wink, wink. Or are you buying it because you think it's going to really add to your collection? So for me, getting really clear about my why has been really important, and it's definitely a strategy that I want to adopt moving forward. Another strategy that I thought might be really helpful is to use the 24-hour rule. Now, this is something that I think a lot of different places and things and processes have a 24-hour rule. The one I'm pulling from is the one that comes from Little League, where when my husband and I were on the Little League board when our kids were little, the 24-hour rule was that if you had an issue, you waited 24 hours before you brought it to the board, right? So the idea was to let cooler heads prevail and for things to calm down. And then if it was still an issue, basically the next day, then bring it up. So I think that same process, because I tend to sometimes shop emotionally, because sometimes if I had a bad day or something and I'm I'm just emotional shop, right? It's a little retail therapy. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I don't want to go into all that, but using the 24-hour rule I think is sometimes helpful. That is a collecting strategy that I've been using the last couple months, is that I put things primarily with Amazon, because I'm the worst with Amazon, to put things in my Amazon account, and then I let it sit there. And I come back to it and I look at it again. And sometimes I let it sit for longer and I come back to it again. Sometimes it'll be a couple of weeks where I'm do I still want this deck? Yep, still want it, still there. Do I still want it? Yep, still want it, still there. Or sometimes when I come back in a day or two or a week, I'm I've kind of changed my mind on it. The moment's passed, and so I take it back out of my cart. I've actually found that to be hugely helpful over the last couple of months, and is definitely a strategy that I want to continue working with moving forward. So another, I think, good strategy is to watch videos or walkthroughs or look up reviews of a deck so that you can kind of get a little bit of a feel for it before you actually make the purchase, right? Sometimes I will admit, for me, and I know my videos do this too, that sometimes you see a video and the person is so excited about it, you're just yes, I have to have that deck too because so-and-so was so jazzed about it. I know I'm totally guilty of it, right? I do it. Other people experience that from watching my videos. But I think the majority of the time, because we do tend to watch channels and people that resonate with us in our personal practice, a lot of times I find that if somebody else is really excited about it and I'm a subscriber of their channel and I enjoy their content, chances are I'm probably going to like the decks that they recommend too. That's why I watch them, right? Watching somebody else walk through a deck or give a review or show a deck can kind of key you in a little bit to the deck's energy, its structure for sure, and what the artwork looks like, maybe what the book looks like, and all the things of that nature. So sometimes watching videos can help you kind of make those decisions about whether or not that's a deck that's going to work for you. Now, occasionally, if you're like me, it bites you in the butt because you're like, oh my goodness, this person was so excited about it and I have to have it too. And I get it home and I'm like, oh, it doesn't work for me. Again, back to rehoming those decks that don't work for you, right? That's a huge one that I have to work on. So another key strategy that I'm going to be adopting myself is to keep a wish list, or I have a wish list and a shopping cart on Amazon, but to keep a list of the decks that I want to buy and then to only buy decks that are on those lists. So basically it has to go onto a list, which means I need time to think about it before I can purchase it. So the goal with that is to try and curtail those impulse purchases. So if I put it on my wish list or I put it in my Amazon cart and I just leave it there for a while, we're kind of roping in that 24-hour rule, but also just kind of keeping things curtailed down to not impulse buying, right? Just kind of keeping a list of here's the decks that I want. And if I only purchase decks that are on that list, then I'll be less likely to impulse buy decks in the moment. That's the theory anyway. We'll see how it goes. Another thing that I found to be really helpful is to actually have sort of what I call a deck buying day. So I have a specific day that is set aside each month that I kind of go through all of my decks that I want to buy, and that's the day that I purchase them on. So basically what that means is that throughout the month, I'm creating those lists and those cards, right? And I'm constantly refining them because I'm looking at decks again, or maybe at this point now I've watched a couple more walkthroughs and I've decided, yes, that deck really is a good fit for me, or no, it's not, and it's come off my list or off my cart. But by setting a specific day that I make those purchases, I know when it's coming, right? So I know that by this particular day, I need to have my cart and my list kind of curated to what I'm gonna buy. Now, sometimes this can just be 1 or 2 decks. I'm not talking about buying, a dozen decks. We're talking about a handful, 1, 2, maybe 3 at the most. So maybe it seems a little bit overkill to kind of do all of that just to buy 1 or 2 decks. But again, if I don't kind of draw the line somewhere, I'm just going to keep adding and I'm going to be right back where I was to that full on deck overwhelm with my decks just spilling out into my room everywhere. And that's really what I'm trying to avoid. So the final collecting strategy that has been recommended to me, so I'm going to pass along as well, is the 1 in, 1 out method. So basically when you get your collection to that comfortable point, you are basically, if you bring in a deck, 1 leaves your collection. And I don't know if this is such a hard and fast rule for a lot of people, but the basic idea is that you're constantly keeping your collection around the same size. So if you're bringing in new decks, then you're going to let a few decks go so that you keep your collection at that comfortable and manageable size for you. So I think that's definitely a really interesting strategy. I know it works well for a lot of people, so that's definitely something I want to pass along and something I want to try myself. So that was pretty much how my entire deck declutter adventure went. The lessons that I learned, the questions that I asked myself, and what my final takeaways were. So as I always say with anything you hear on my channel, take what resonates with you and leave the rest behind. I hope that you found something interesting here, and I would love to know if you're doing any sort of deck decluttering. Have you learned any lessons? Do you have any tips to share? I would love to know, so please feel free to share with me in the comments below. Thank you for joining me today. You'll find links for everything featured here in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.